life, that we've got a lot of resources, a lot of experience to draw on. Now, how do we make use of that and make this practical? So this session will have 2, maybe 3 parts to it. One is me talking, giving you a bit of background on some of the thinking that's emerging around the world on rethinking pastoralism and dryland development. But I also want to then ground that in your own experiences and start to think about what this means practically for moving ahead with development in a new way that is compatible with, supports pastoral development. What we all passionately want to do, but too often doesn't happen for the reasons we've already discussed. And for that reason, we want to talk about and interrogate and challenge the narrative. A narrative is simply a story that we tell about the world. It has a beginning, it has a middle, it has an end. But narratives frame what is funded, what we do, what's implemented on the ground, and suggests what the problems are and so solutions. And I think the narrative about pastoralism that Gufu already introduced last night is often problematic, and we need to shift our understandings. Narratives, of course, are political. They get stuck. They have power. They're embedded in people, in institutions, in funding streams. That's why challenging narratives is not always straightforward. It's not just about creating new knowledge. There's plenty of that. Gufu and I have been producing books for years and years and years, but still things don't necessarily change. So what does have to change? We have to embed our new thinking in practice, and that means in the things that you guys do. And that's why this summer school is so important, about taking ideas and challenging these ideas. I mean, we don't have a solution. Let me give you advance warning. There's not a nice, neat package for you to take home and suddenly implement. That's why this summer school is about work and working together. Because today we're in a different geopolitical moment. We've all been through the cuts in the aid funding. The powers that used to exist have shifted. We're in a different moment for development and thinking. Now, there's one response to that is just to say, oh no, this is terrible, we've lost our funding, what do we do? This is a nightmare. And, you know, people have been through those nightmares. We've seen some of the changes in jobs that have happened just in the last year on people's rivers of life. But I think these moments are also opportunities. And opportunities to grasp now in a positive way about thinking about going forward. So, pastoralism, livestock, is affected by a whole array of dominant narratives. This is the case around the world. It exists. It's the case in India, in Kenya, but it's also the case in Northern Europe, where I come from, in Australia and elsewhere. Livestock and pastoralists in particular have been given a very bad press. You've heard these narratives before. These are livelihoods that are deemed unviable, they're backward, they need modernisation, they're seen to be destructive of the environment, they cause conflict. The argument goes that they need to be transformed through a particular process of development into a fixed, settled, intensive livestock system. New breeds, stall feeding, ranches, feed imports, the whole array of modernizing forms of development that have been pushed in pastoral areas for decades and decades and decades. And if not livestock-based, then pastoralists should shift to crop production. If livestock is finished, pastoralism is finished, crop production, irrigation, alternative livelihoods. Much of the debate about pastoralism and livestock development is affected by this negative narrative. Now, this is not to say that pastoralism should just stay as it is, in some kind of archaic form that has existed for centuries. No, pastoralism does and must change. But what change is the crucial question. Now, these pictures on here, if you can see them, are from China, from Italy, from Tunisia, and indeed from Kenya. But these could be pictures from any country in the world. The story is incredibly similar. And we have done research in all of these countries over the last years through the Pastoralism program. And we've seen that the result is a set of policies that we see in country after country and over time, from the colonial period to the present, which is focusing pastoral development on the principles of stability, simplification, management, control. It's a very particular type of development, modernized development. And that means, as I've said before, settlement schemes, investments in narrow versions of animal productivity, fixed, large-scale technical markets, controlled and delimited grazing areas and routes, and so on. And we very often think, in the way that we think about development, is that these technologies, markets, and external interventions can fix the problem. All we need is some money from some donor. We'll do a project around these ideas and it will fix the problem. So in response to crises and emergencies, we've had a whole array of different solutions for the drylands. Satellite-based, AI-driven early warning systems, defined trigger-based anticipatory action, insurance products, and so on. All of these are aimed at reducing variability and uncertainty and providing management and control. Now, not all of these solutions, not all of these diagnoses are wrong. Mark my words, they're not necessarily wrong, but they carry with them very often some very powerful biases. If only we could control, we could manage, we could make stable, then everything would be okay. If pastoralists were more like us, the settled people of agrarian societies, people live in towns, then things would be better. But we've seen much experience over many decades, and I'm sure many of you have experienced this yourselves practically, is that these biases in development and humanitarian intervention can actually make matters worse. They often reduce the capacities of livestock keepers to make use of variability in fodder, in water, and so on, as a productive resource, and so live with and from uncertainty. And so, in doing so, these interventions, because they seek to control rather than live with the existing system, they can undermine resilience. Even resilience projects can undermine resilience, as we'll discuss. But I want to suggest that there's an alternative, and it's an alternative that's been talked about a lot, and it's a much more positive one, and it builds on what Gufu was saying yesterday, that is much more relevant to the drylands and the hills and mountains where pastoralists live. As Hussein said earlier, over half the world's land surface is rangelands. It includes perhaps 1 billion people associated with the use of these rangelands. It's not a marginal question for global development. It's a massively important one, because not only are these some of the most poor and marginalized peoples in the world, but they're also the people who manage and are guardians of some of the most important ecosystems and sources of biodiversity in the world. So getting pastoralist development right really matters. As I've said already, the track record is exceptionally poor. So I don't really need to have this slide for this audience, but I want to just reiterate what are some of the characteristics of a pastoral system, because that's what we're going to try and think about later in some discussion groups. What are the principles of pastoralism that allow it to function, that maybe we can support in new ways, rather than just trying to undermine, change, create an alternative. So these are what we call in ecology non-equilibrium systems. We don't have to use that term. It means they're highly variable. You know this. In one area it rains, the next area it doesn't. In one area there is a dense population of livestock that have caused some degradation. In another there is huge amount of grass, and so on. Variability in time, in space, is absolutely critical for livestock systems in these areas, and mobility that goes with that is important. But as I've said, there's been a long history of inappropriate development policies that have assumed these places are productive, unproductive, environmentally destructive, backward in a sense. So, there are many constraints and challenges for supporting pastoralism these days. They've already been mentioned. Climate change is the most obvious one, increasing not necessarily the overall amount of rainfall, but its variability. Pastoralists over centuries have been brilliant at tracking the variability of rainfall and rangelands, but with increasing variability of rainfall, it becomes more and more challenging. So their skills have to be enhanced. There's been a whole suite of land and green grabbing. It was talked about in respect of Isiolo. The areas of space for pastoralists are becoming increasingly constrained, whether that's the expansion of agriculture, irrigated agriculture, alternative energy, wind farms, solar farms, geothermal, etc. Mining has been talked about, conservation and conservancies, carbon projects, infrastructure, urbanization. These are processes that are happening. We cannot ignore. They're affecting pastoralism. So what does the new form of pastoralism look like when land and resources become more constrained? And pastoral systems are not what they were 30, 40, 50 years ago, more egalitarian societies. There's a much greater differentiation, a capture by elites, often absentee owners involved in managing livestock from afar, a proletarianization of pastoralists who become workers and herders rather than pastoralists themselves, and processes of political incorporation that happen in different places in different ways, and in Kenya obviously through the devolution process and the recognition of the ASAL areas. What does that mean for thinking about pastoral development? So there are new challenges. So let's not forget these new challenges, not pretend that things are going to be easy in supporting pastoral development. But all of this results in new forms of pastoralism that is changing, and it's changing fast. Many of you are from pastoral families. Many of you, no doubt, have livestock yourselves. And you know it's more constrained, but you also know that it's more possible to manage remotely and intelligently with the use of technologies and new forms of labor arrangements, and with that changing age and gender relations in pastoral areas. And again, whether we're talking about Sardinia in Europe, in Italy, or whether we're talking about Tibet in China, or the Gujarat in India, all of which were places we worked in the Pastres program together with Tahira, who was the Kenya PhD student. These are processes that we see again and again everywhere. But the argument is, don't give up. Think about what challenges there are, but find solutions for them. So I'm going to quickly ask you if you can think of any other challenges that pastoralists face in the places you work. Just shout it out and we can add it to the flip chart is gone, but anyway, we can add it to our mental notes of what challenges pastoralists face. We've mentioned land grabbing, we've mentioned green grabbing, we've mentioned elite capture, we've mentioned devolution. What else can we add? Anyone got some ideas, and we can add it to the list? Because let's be realistic about what the challenges are.
The land is largely rendered unproductive.
Yeah, brilliant, good. Prosopis, the great gift from FAO. Yes.
A socio-economic challenge might be probably the generational change, because the new generation may no longer find pastoralism a lucrative endeavor. So probably with time it risks probably shrinking.
Generational change, is that what you said, yes?
Yes, generational change.
So young people don't necessarily want to do pastoralism like their parents did, but they still want to do pastoralism. So what is it? Any other challenges? Quickly, yeah. Yeah, conflict with arable crop farmers. So this was already mentioned in the Nigerian case, but is an issue right across these regions as arable areas expand. Please, more. Commercialized cattle rustling. Yeah, you mentioned that several times, and I think that's important. The growth of small arms, which has occurred in many areas, has given, we're going to get lost. Let's not have any commentary. Haro, labor access and schooling. It was very interesting hearing in your several of those rivers of life that a crisis in pastoralism encouraged people to go to school, and then people came back. So there's that relationship between pastoral labor and schooling. Cultural beliefs. Okay, we can unpack that later, but let's put it here now. Cultural beliefs can be positive, they can be negative, they can be assumed, they can be rahma, green energy and so on. I'm going to put this up here. Green energy, land grabbing, that type of thing. Let's finish the. Yeah, please, Festus. Yeah, population increase and urbanization. Yeah. There was a study done of Isiolo town in 1973 by Anders Hjort. And if you look back at that book and you think, wow, is that Isiolo now? Population and urbanization. Okay, let's have one or two more only, because I'm only going to have this one page. Yes, please. Resource-based conflict, which a lot of these there are. And one more. Sedentarisation. Right, okay, so we're going to be discussing this. I'll put this under cultural belief, mindsets, and we've had sedentarisation, people wanting to be in town with their DSTV, they're not moving necessarily. Go on, one more. People. You're too enthusiastic. We'll come back to you.
I don't know if it's already captured, but in a place like Ethiopia, government is very intentional. It's pushing pastoralism.
They're pushing? Policies, yeah. Well, let's put it near sedentarisation, because whether it's Ethiopia or China, there's big pushes to sedentarize people, which obviously has advantages if people want to have schools and clinics, but at the same time potentially undermines their mobility. I'm going to stop this here because we don't want to have too many challenges. We can add to this list as we go along. So, contemporary challenges sometimes mean people just throw up their hands and say, hey, we have to give up. People who are as old as me will remember discussions in the 1980s, and Gufu will remember some of these, where exactly the same happened. Oh, there are too many people, there's too much conflict, there's too much land degradation, there's too much, there's fewer opportunities for pastoralists. That negative view of pastoralism, which is just an accumulation of challenges, has been with us for decades. And it's partly the cultural mindsets of donors and of educated urban people. So that's why let's not put cultural beliefs and mindsets only to pastoralists. Let's put it also to others. Because there has been this argument that pastoralism is over forever. You can go back to the colonial records in Kenya and see colonial officials saying this is finished. Well, that was 50, 70, 80 years ago, and pastoralism is still continuing, still providing an important livelihood for many, but not without challenges. So I want to discuss a number of themes very quickly, and I'll run through these very quickly. So mobility. You know the standard narrative, we talked about it already, that mobility is disruptive, it's backward, it's a cause of conflicts, it undermines productivity. People should be settled, they should adopt a modern and sedentary lifestyle. We need to do this through settlement schemes, through fixed plots, through ranches, water points placed in particular places. But in dryland areas, and this is what the ecology tells us and a lot of science, making the productive use of variable landscapes can only be done through movement of grazing animals and people through that environment. And this is why the flexibility of movement is so important and why it cannot be curtailed, although, as we've seen, it is being curtailed by this squeeze on access to resources over time. So if we're going to think about mobility as central to policy, we've got to think beyond corridors and transborder protocols to thinking about how we develop the infrastructure to allow pastoralists to sustain mobility even under these constrained situations, to negotiate with farmers, to negotiate with urban areas, and to interact in more successful ways despite these constraints. And as I've said, there's lots of technologies, the use of mobile phones and motorbikes for surveillance and so on, assist this mobility. But it's a big, big challenge, and one that we're going to come back to again and again. So a principle of mobility, how to sustain mobility, is a key factor. In relation to land and the environment, questions of environmental degradation and so on are often up there in the complaints about pastoralists. Remember, Gufu was telling the story that Walter Lusigi said that you have to repeat the word desertification if you want to get money. Well, that idea that all you have to do is just look at a pastoral rangeland and all you see is degradation because it's overstocked, the trees are destroyed, is a very, very deeply embedded cultural belief from colonial times. Colonial vision of landscapes were not dryland landscapes. We don't have places that look like Isiolo in England. So colonial officers often just didn't understand the nature of these and imposed, often from Australia actually and from the US, these type of fixed rotational grazing systems, the ranch systems that have failed so many times across Africa over so long. But the new ecology that Gufu was beginning to talk about thinking about variability, thinking about heterogeneity, thinking about patch use and so on, and the complex of savanna systems that involve people, grazing, fire in different combinations, suggests that variability is central and that degradation, it does happen, is less of a problem because carrying capacities in that old-fashioned way do not exist as assumed. And of course, pastoralism supports a whole variety of other ecosystem functions. It enhances biodiversity through movement and seed dispersal. It connects fragmented patches in landscapes, so it can be critical for environments. And within rangeland landscapes, there are particular patches, wetlands within drylands, areas of riverine areas, places which have grass at the last days of the dry season that are absolutely important for that ecosystem to function. But those areas are the wetter areas. They're the areas that tend to be grabbed by irrigated agriculture. They get grabbed by areas for urban development and so on. And that type of investment, if the full assessment of that investment is not done properly, you can undermine a whole system by removing just a small portion from it because you've removed that last resort grazing from the overall pastoral area. So policies need to have a much better appreciation of these variable, uncertain, non-equilibrial environments. And we're very poor at that because of our beliefs that the land should be managed through stability and control. So this requires much more flexible, open tenure systems, systems that allow us to encourage movement across a mosaic of different types of rangeland. Now, we've talked about climate quite a few times, and there's a standard narrative that exists, particularly in the West, that livestock are the cause of climate change, or not the cause, but a primary cause of climate change. And the livestock are often portrayed as the big climate villains in wider debates. Go to any of the COPs on climate and you'll hear all the negative narratives that you need and more about livestock. But these are very simplistic narratives and often based on aggregate figures that don't work when we think about the type of pastoral systems that we work in and live in. There's an argument that we should shift to vegetarianism because plant-based foods make sense. But animal-based products are essential for nutrition. And indeed, in many parts of the world, including most pastoral areas, people need more of the type of proteins, vitamins, folates, and so on that meat and milk can provide. So livestock, of course, emit methane. We know that. It's a simple fact of ruminant production. And methane is a gas that creates global heating. There is no dispute about that. But we have to ask which livestock, where, and produced in what system. So it's not the product that's at fault, milk or meat, it's the process through which that milk or meat is produced. Industrial systems versus mobile pastoralist systems that matters. So in contrast to those industrial contained livestock systems, pastoralism is a much lower impact system with potentials for carbon sequestration and lumping together these type of livestock systems in global debates can do huge ill service to pastoralists and injustices arise. So this doesn't mean that climate change is not happening. But we need to think about where the mitigation measures happen and in what systems, and support pastoralism as a low-impact system which is very effective at adaptation to climate variability over long periods of time. Let's move to another theme that some of you have worked on fairly intensively, on markets. Now, there's nothing wrong with markets. We want markets, and pastoralists for millennia have been incredibly engaged in long-distance markets. Think about the cross-Sahara trade. Think about the trade from East Africa into the Middle East. Think about the different types of livestock trade that have been absolutely essential to sustaining urban areas and the growth of civilizations around the world and pastoral production. But there is a particular type of market development that we've seen in Kenya, but also in many, many other parts of the world, that doesn't necessarily work compatible with pastoral systems. Big, fixed, technologically sophisticated market facilities allowing segregation and tracing and the rest isn't necessarily appropriate for the type of value chains that exist in pastoral areas. So unlike these big fixed markets and the development projects that we so often see, and indeed that so often fail, pastoral markets, as we know, are diverse, they're networked, they're nested, they have long and short chains, they're managed by different people. The role of brokers is absolutely key, and traders. And you know all this. You only have to go to any of the markets in this region to see this operating. Why can't we support that system rather than replacing it with a different type of technological market system, more appropriate to Texas than Marsabit? Conflict is another of those narratives that we hear again and again, and has been mentioned a few times. And the argument, of course, runs that it's pastoralists, because they're mobile, that cause this conflict with farmers and others. And they need to be stabilized, contained, pacified, often through quite militarized security forms of intervention, and ideally settled so that they can be managed by the state, and so on. And a lot of the debate about pastoral conflicts and conflicts between farmers in the Sahel, for example, is explained in these terms. But we have to ask, what are the underlying causes of these conflicts, and including the commercialized forms of conflict that we've been talking about? Conflicts, of course, emerge because of long-term neglect of pastoral areas by the state and others, the fragmentations of local authorities, increasing social stratification, the growth of absentee herd owners who are not accountable for their herds in the same way as local owners are, and the resource grabbing and resource conflicts for agriculture, energy, and so on that we've talked about, increase the vulnerabilities of pastoralists and the need to secure resources further afield. The result is people move further, conflicts arise, and we're into this cycle of conflict that we see again and again, exacerbated by the existence of small arms that come from wider conflicts in these regions. But there's a huge amount of research that suggests if we rethink how conflict emerges and rethink about how peace building can happen, it's a return to the type of negotiated alternatives and the sharing of resources supported by the state that is needed. And this suggests very different thinking about policy implementation around peace building and development more broadly. Let me get to the final two before concluding and moving into some working groups. Many of you work for humanitarian organizations or organizations that deliver humanitarian aid as development organizations. And there is a central narrative about crisis and disaster in pastoral areas. And I think that narrative is quite problematic. There have been huge investments in humanitarian aid, social protection schemes, and so on in pastoral areas across the world to respond to recurrent emergencies and disasters. A big array of technical and financial instruments have been deployed and developed to respond to this. I've mentioned some of them already. High-tech early warning systems based on satellite measurement of land cover, anticipatory action triggers, preset protocols and action plans for response, parametric insurance, livestock insurance products, and so on. You know them all. They all operate in northern Kenya, but they exist around the world in pastoral areas. And these, in turn, have been linked to a variety of other humanitarian interventions of the delivery of aid, food aid, but also increasingly cash transfers to vulnerable individuals and households who've been targeted and in turn registered to be identified as at-risk people for receiving humanitarian aid. Now, I'm not saying that all of this is mistaken. Indeed, in many situations, we need this type of response. But I'm also saying that very often we've got stuck in a particular technological, financial, fixed modality of responding to these crises in ways that's not so attuned to how pastoralism operates and how pastoralists think. For example, many of these delivery mechanisms ignore local systems of support, collective local systems of support, of redistribution. Many of the early warning approaches do not end up with deliberation between different types of knowledges, local knowledge and external knowledge from the satellites. Many of the anticipation and preparedness mechanisms assume a particular trigger and remove the context within which people have to respond and prepare. This is because emergencies and the funding associated with emergencies tend to be associated with a single idea of a crisis, not an unfolding situation, which for pastoralists is the continuous experience of droughts, which are not seen as a single moment, but part and parcel of life. They're a process, not a singular thing. The crisis response is associated with funding, it's associated with bureaucracy of humanitarian agencies, it's associated with logistic systems and so on, and the result is that they're top-down, they're conditioned by rapid deployment, logistics, funding approaches, and they ignore local capacities and responses on the ground. We know this, but what can be the alternative? And that's what we're going to be discussing. They also focus on targeting individuals and households because of the need for registries and the accountability in those systems, and not the collective forms of organisation that exist in pastoral areas that actually do the job of social protection in the informal sense. Too often, as we all know, to our cost, humanitarian responses are late and often inappropriate. And at worst, they can undermine local responses. The lack of attention to local forms of assistance, sharing arrangements, moral economies as it's called, is a problem and is a way also of thinking about the future. So if we're to root our understandings less in this top-down classic form of humanitarianism, but more rooted in pastoral societies, an everyday form of humanitarianism, we must move from focusing on a single crisis event, time-limited, to continuous forms of support that go up and down, that are more embedded in local systems, part of local social protection, unfolding over time. It means shifting our early warning from a high-tech, top-down approach, where you've got a single answer of when the drought will come, to a deliberation, a discussion amongst different people with different sources of knowledge about early warning. Because early warnings are always uncertain, that requires deliberation. It means moving from elaborate targeting and registration systems, in my view, of individuals and households to working more through local collective arrangements, through kin networks, through local institutions, through groups associated with mosques and churches. And it means redefining anticipatory action from one based on predefined triggers to one where contextual information is important in delivering that support. So given the shifting focus of crisis, emergencies and disasters, it means not just early action, which is the mantra now, to a crisis, but continuous action to unfolding conditions. Anticipatory action moves from a purely trigger-based technical mode to a flexible mode grounded in pastoral logics and of uncertainty, as Sam Derbyshire has explained. Now, changing humanitarian and aid systems towards this type of pastoral approach is difficult. There are big vested interests, there are bureaucratic systems, there's funding environments, and so on. But as I said before, I think there's a moment now when the aid system is under question and people are debating the humanitarian reset for this debate to happen. And there will be an important session on this tomorrow, led by Liz Stites and Tahira, to explore this a bit further. Finally, one of the shifts in humanitarian development funding over the past decades, we've seen the logos change, the names of projects change, is the shift to what has been called resilience building, or humanitarian project-based resilience. And in most pastoral areas, resilience building has been associated with trying, yet again, to shift pastoralists out of being pastoralists to alternative livelihoods, away from pastoralism. The argument is, once again, pastoralism is finished, it needs to be transformed, and there are huge burdens of humanitarian and aid funding that need to be relieved. We need to find alternatives. Fine, but what alternatives? You know the type of projects that have been tried: irrigated agriculture, chicken projects, fodder banks, vegetable gardens, formed through groups of women and young people very often, funded for a particular intervention. Many of the NGOs, particularly before the collapse of US aid funding, spent their lives doing these type of projects. But did they support pastoralism? Too often these projects, as we all know, failed. Very often we blame the implementation. Oh, they didn't, the process wasn't quite right. Governance, the governance arrangements weren't quite right. Or challenges of funding, we didn't have enough money to do it properly. But the real reason of these failures, I think, and this is a debate we can have, is that they're not building on the type of resilience of pastoral systems from below. Now, we're going to talk about the alternatives of this with Rahma this afternoon and at other points in the workshop. But we've been making an argument that if we work with pastoralists and the systems that they are involved with, the type of high reliability networks that they already use, and support that rather than trying to replace it, we can develop a different type of resilience, one that is starting from below. And that means supporting shopkeepers with credit, water managers with their skill of managing water and grazing access, the boda drivers who are involved in transporting fodder and surveillance around conflict, the women's group managing fodder, for example. Many, many more examples that we'll discuss that are the potential for an alternative way of thinking about resilience. So this means rejecting many of these standard alternative livelihood projects promoted as resilience building, and thinking about supporting existing systems that in a low-cost, more appropriate way that we'll discuss later in our discussions of some of the pilot projects we're testing this all out in. So I've run on too much. Here is a quick summary of some of these themes. Now, of course, this is a simplified thing, and I'm not going to go through this because we don't have time, but the shift from the existing narrative to a new narrative, which is backed already by substantial research and experience on the ground, is an important one if we're to sustain the opportunities of pastoralism as the most viable, the most productive, the most modern in many ways system for managing the drylands. And I think, as I said before, in the context of changing aid policy and the funding environment that we exist in, we need to think about these principles, these new principles of the new narrative that we need to go ahead with. So what are some of these principles that we should think about? Mobility. What else? Yeah. Shout. Indigenous knowledge. Yeah, IK. I'll do a short version. This side. You can have another go in a minute. Go on. Sustainability. Okay, so making sure these things, the interventions. Keep shouting. Yeah, so collective social support networks. I put a lot in there. Networks, collective, social. You've got 3 in 1 there. Consultation and engagement. Maybe more than consultation, not just asking people. Huh? Co-creation, okay. Go on, you can come back. Policy dialogue. So making sure all of this Sorry, say again?
Right now they are in development, but they are in process. So they need to now focus around the main livelihood.
Right.
So it's pastoral and pastoral first.
Okay. Pastoral first. I will put that there as part of the policy reframing. Yeah? Risk-informed. So, understanding, I'm going to add to this variability. And indeed uncertainty. We won't go into this, but it's different to risk, where we don't know what we don't know. Okay, this is enough for now. We can add more. We can add more and think about them, because it's these principles that have to be very much part and parcel of our thinking. I had a couple more on mine which I am going to add. The need to be adaptive and allow experimentation and improvisation. Things are not fixed. We've got to be responsive. And to go beyond the crisis as a single moment. Okay, not have everything bound up as an emergency and a crisis and a disaster. We'll add to them. I think this is an important list for us to start to have, because if we have this list in our back pocket when we're designing the next concept note, when we're reporting back to our bosses, we have to think, is this project compatible with these principles? So, moving to a new narrative means, as it were, rethinking how we act, how we design, how we think. It needs to challenge how we think about time when we act. It needs to challenge us who we should be involved with, who are the actors. It needs to challenge us what should be done, what are the actions that need to be done. And it needs to challenge us how we work with local communities, not just through performative consultation, but genuine co-creation. So, all of that suggests, I'm not going to even use that, that we should move to a group session where we can spend, lunch is at 1, so we'll spend half an hour in our groups only, and I was going to suggest that we will move tables, but maybe the time is not with us and we will stay on our tables. Huh? So, what I'm going to suggest is that you have 20 minutes, thereabouts, discussion. This is not going to be the end of this discussion. No way. This is the beginning of moving from big ideas to grounding it in practice. This is a practitioner's summer school after all. So I'm going to suggest there are 6 tables, but we have 8. So I am going to suggest that we... Okay, I can do it from here. That we move from... Okay, table 1. You're going to think about information. Use of research, use of early warning information, how it gets used, right? You guys, investment. I can see you are the sort of people who have money. Right, you got a lot of money. What are you going to do in presenting your investment plans that support pastoralism rather than undermine it? Some of you guys, I think, have got money too. You have to come over here. Now, we're now going to think about delivery and targeting. This is the group that's going to think about delivery and targeting. How do we get to the right people in the end? What are the mechanisms of doing so? There are standard mechanisms, but should we be thinking about other mechanisms? I've done 3. Right, policy. You're the big policy people. Oh, we've got Michael here. This is good. And you. Yeah, both of you. It's you. Right, you've got the policy people. How do you change policy? We've been trying to do this forever. How do we get policy dialogue in ways that genuinely make a difference? That respond to these criteria in ways that are meaningful. Then we're going to go to the implementation group. His river of life was so long and complicated that he's got lots to contribute. So, implementation and project design. What are the principles that should design project? We should think about the design of projects and their implementation. Okay, and then the final group, and those who are not in groups, that's probably you two. Your final group, you're going to think about financing. So this is slightly different to investment, but how should we use finance? Let's assume the county government has some finance. Let's assume the NGO has some finance. How do we use that finance to support pastoralists in different ways, in uncertain and variable settings? The discussions that we've just been having will have in different forms again and again, hopefully coming to some more concrete ways forward as we move through the program. But this was just to get this on the table right at the beginning. If we don't have a plan by the end of it, then at least we have a way forward which is concrete, practical, and related to the challenges at hand. So, this is not to push you to come to anything definitive at this point. Let's just have a quick reflection from each of you on what you heard. So, information.
We were handling information, and the information, then timing. Then the first thing is to understand the cycle. That is the current. Within Kenya, we have 2 seasons, and we have MAM, and then O&D season. Then also understanding at what time are we giving this information, at what time are we giving this information to the local community. So the first thing is to understand which is the right stage that we need to give this information. we also have flexibility in adjustment and adjustment of that information. Who is to receive this information? How is it going to be given? We know our local communities, language is a barrier. So at the end of the day, you don't just formulate a statement that you think has reached to everybody. So you have to give an information that is relevant to everybody. Then going to actors which will be involved. We have local community institutions, the pastoralists themselves, the local communities that the community members are working with. Then we have research and institutions which are based within those areas. We also have the government frontline workers at the relevant department, if it is Department of Environment and Natural Resources for any early action or any action that needed to be communicated. Then we also have faith-based institutions, including mosques, churches, and also the community elders, the trusted team, because if you go into these community members, they are this group that they trust more than any other person. If you visit or if you stay with them, if an information comes from a community elder, that information is more trusted than when a scientist comes and says, there will be a disaster coming. They may not trust it. So maybe the information is accurate, but they have their sources that they trust most. Then we have local administration at the county government level, the national government level, chiefs and sub-county administrators. And then we have the non-state actors, NGOs, development organizations within the county government, within the regions that they are working. Then we go to actors, which will be what should be done. Use of technology. In the current world, we are using so much on mobile phone, WhatsApps. Though the local community may not buy the idea of WhatsApp, but then the information can reach to them very easily. If you look at a case scenario currently at homes, you may post something in the WhatsApp pages, and at the end of the day, the local mother is asking, what is it that is being discussed? I hear people are saying 1, 2, 3 within the social media. So it is something that we also need to buy. Then we have local radios. We have radios in every county, I think, based on the local dialect, local vernacular languages. So that information can be easily related to the local community once done through that. Then identification of local network within the area. We can use either youth groups, women groups, or any other organization that is existing within that area. You can pass the information through that area and it easily get to the final person. Then information of participatory scenarios. We have networks of technical working groups under every sector. For instance, in Marsabit, I was made to understand we have technical working groups on environment. We have technical working groups on agriculture. We have technical working groups on gender. A number of them are existing. So information can also be passed through those working groups. Then we have implementation through the local networks. We have local institutions working within those communities. We have CBOs or groups or women groups who are very active and they implement some few activities. If you do information through them, it can also be it can reach to the final user. Then funding and support, use of locally available networks for programmings within the area. Not necessarily you look for a big donor, but then some donors also implement through the local network. So you can use that information to outsource for funding. For instance, if an organization has only 1 million shillings and the other one has 500 shillings, and then you get 500,000, and then you have about 10 or 5 of them within that area. An activity that they themselves cannot implement, once they come together as a social network, then at the end of the day, they can implement something which is substantial within that community.
There was a lot there, but I think the key points were around timing and flexibility and embedding the process of sharing within networks where there are trusted individuals. Trust is so key. Information is something, but unless it's trusted, it's not going to go anywhere. So I think your emphasis on local networks and local networks of trust is something that we'll pick up more when we talk about high reliability in another session. So yeah, it's not just about the technology, but technology can help. It's not just about the information, although that's important. It's about how that information gets out, in what form. There are some lessons there for NDMA and others, I think, but all of us who work in this space, I think this is a very helpful summary.
Rangelands in terms of issues like provision of water, water security, and general improvement of rangelands. We have issues to do with transboundary livestock diseases. There are high incidences of livestock diseases. So investments in strengthening the livestock health services, veterinary services are also needed. In terms of market system, we talked about issues of standardization. How do you determine the price? Issues of, can we talk about selling based on live weight or stuff like that, as opposed to, the normal approach where there's no proper basis for a proper price determination. Issues of creating linkages between livestock producers and buyers. We also discussed about the need for relooking at the value addition aspect. We noticed that we have a lot of facilities, a lot of them around which are not operationalized yet. Talk about the abattoirs that we have. They need to be operationalized. Talk about even the airport that we have in Isiolo, for example. It was supposed also to play the role of helping people to access terminal markets. We talked about issues of mobility, strengthening peace, mapping out migration routes, and also the issue of land use planning. Of course, the issue of livelihood diversification has to come up again, not in terms of replacing pastoralism or livestock keeping, but as alternative, complementary livelihood diversification, which really takes care of the context in which this is happening. And we also actually observed that this diversification can even happen within pastoralism itself. It doesn't have to be now we are moving away from pastoralism to other things. It could be complementary as such. Issues of infrastructure, we saw it overlaps a bit with information, but infrastructure related to supporting the dissemination of early warning messages. We're talking about the last minute dissemination of early warning messages, also really very important as aspect of investment. Last but not least, we also talked about the issue of insurance, and we saw that, of course, there's been a lot of effort over the years on insurance, but we need to relook again while learning what has happened, where we have succeeded, we have not succeeded, but we think that investments in insurance is still also one of the issues that we want to really further discussions around. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Festus. The principles of mobility, the principles of flexibility, the principles of collective management of resources, etc., etc. Because there's a real danger is that we all have these lists in our heads. Download, markets, veterinary, land use planning, There's nothing wrong with all of those, but the fact is that the past experience of doing all of those hasn't always been successful. Insurance is a good case in point. So thank you for the list. The list is correct, but I think we need to probe that and push that a little bit further to ask, how can investments of this sort be adjusted? If you're thinking about infrastructure, where do you put that road? If you're thinking about water resources, where do you put that borehole? If you're thinking about land use planning, how do you think about the relationship between livestock mobility and urban development, and so on and so on. So I think there's more work to do. I mean, we weren't expecting you to complete this work in half an hour or 45 minutes, but that's why we need to be careful of simply just downloading the list. Okay, next one is delivery and targeting.
There is need for a clear communication strategy to enhance dissemination of information to the pastoralist communities. This has to be a consultative process that brings on board all people, all segments of the communities, all the stakeholders. When it comes to geographical targeting, it is very necessary to involve all the stakeholders and identify those geographical areas that needs to be invested in. At the community level, there is need for bringing on board each segment of the community and ensuring that we leave no one behind. Every pastoralist must be involved and must be brought on board. In identifying the priorities and coming up with solutions, using the community structures and appreciating the indigenous knowledge and experiences, and also in identifying vulnerable households. Those are the people who know who needs what. So they must be involved in this process, allowing the community members to identify the beneficiaries, and once the beneficiaries are identified, then there is need for validation of the beneficiaries. Without validation, then the list might be in a mess. So to rule out the issues, any issues that may arise, then there must be that validation process that needs to take place. Thank you.
For inclusiveness, but we all know what participation often means. It means just going to a village, speaking to a few people and so on. How do we make sure that everyone is involved? Even if somebody is out in the range with their livestock, even if a herder who is somewhere distant, how do we make sure inclusion is real? It's a real challenge, I think, when we're thinking about delivery. Participation is an easy thing to say. Consultation is an easy thing to tick the box on. But rather like the challenge of the list, how do we move beyond the box ticking to the reality? And so that's really helpful. Using community structures, again, this is something that runs against some of the sensibilities of some of the programming work, which tends to have registers of households from surveys and so on, rather than going into communities and understanding how is that community structured, because there's plenty of redistribution and processes of delivery happening anyway. But how do you work with community structures, I think, is a really important one. One that's not straightforward. Validation is clearly important, but also trust. Just as with the information, to develop the trust with the people to be able to work in a collective manner. So thank you for that. Community structures I'm going to underline there, but let's have avoid the tick box participation approach. How do we really get to this type of understanding of pastoral communities, which are different, let's face it, in their social structure, in their form of organization, in their leadership arrangements than other communities that sometimes NGOs work with. Right, let's move to policy.
We had a discussion amongst ourselves and found out that at the regional level, we also do have cross-border transhuman mobility policy. In as much as that policy, at IGAD level, at regional level is in existence, nevertheless, it might actually not serve us better. And then we felt strongly that we should actually root for policy, that serves, respective counties, represented here. And to that effect, we narrowed down on policies that must recognize pastoralists not as a backward, several centuries old venture, but as a legitimate system of, making use of rangeland resources. So that is one policy, because we are alive to the fact that at county level policies might be there. For example, Marsabit County, we have a rangeland management policy. I don't know whether it is actually operational. And then point number 2 is that a policy that addresses, supports pastoral land use. Pastoral land use. By so saying, pastoralists, they have, wet grazing season areas and also dry season grazing fallback. So there must be, comprehensive policy to an extent that it recognizes, land use policy. For example, some portion might actually, exclusively reserved for, pastoral form of production. Others might be crops, and as such, others might actually be mixed.
So the need for holistic, coordinated, integrated policy, because pastoralism isn't a sector. This is one of the challenges pastoralism faces in many countries. Pastoralism is about markets, it's about water, it's about rangelands, it's about animal breeds, it's about livestock, it's about a whole array of things. So the sectoral approach, the way ministries are often organised, is problematic, as you've said. How to integrate. Devolution should provide that opportunity, but I see very often the devolution just replicates the national divisions of authority. So how to bring in customary authorities, customary systems and so on in a more integrated way. But I think your first point is, if we can filter all these policies by thinking about mobility, we do a mobility check on these policies, then that's a good start. So we need to have people in those systems, in those departments, before we get to the ideal, doing the mobility check, just to make sure that these are policies that are not designed for the highlands of Kenya, but are designed for the rangelands of the north, or ditto in Nigeria or Ghana. Okay, let's move on. Where were we? Implementation, project design.
Give it in a synoptic way, so that, because we have myriads of points here before us. So what we discuss here is that we first of all ensure that we have to identify what actually are we targeting to address. That is the problem before us, then which will form part of our question here. So by the time you decide on what you are targeting, which is the aim of the project, then we have to also devise a means of addressing such a problem, that is through different objectives. So by the time we also consider that objectivity, or the objectivities that we are going to follow in attending to the problem, they will also consider how sustainable such projects can be. Then also, aside being sustainable, we also considered who are the stakeholders in this project, so that in the course of the design, right at the design stage, they will be involved, then, and also decide who is going to do what up to the level of the implementation. So we also take into cognizance the timeline. And by timeline here, we are talking about which of these components of the project is going to be short-term, mid-term, as well as also the long-term when it comes to issue of the implementation. Then we also considered the issue of the community integration, even though they are part of the stakeholders, but how are we going to integrate for them to own the project even thereafter it should be able to thrive well. Then we also consider the aspect of the funding. Among the stakeholders, who are going to fund what, and also who should we contact in an event we have some certain challenges too. Then another one also, the policy makers also should be also considered, because no matter how good your project is, if it's not in consonant with what the policy of a particular area is, you may not be able to achieve anything there. Then we also considered monitoring, evaluation, as well as also learning as part of the project design. Then another also aspect is the issue of the governance, which this one has to also involve down to the grassroots, that is the community, for it to be able to pass down to and be able to see the impact. Then the last one, I think, we look at it from the perspective of how impactful the project is going to be. And by impact here, we are talking about those that are involved in the design of the project, the immediate community, in terms of economic aspects, as well as also the government itself. So in a nutshell, this is just a synopsis of what we have discussed in our group, because we have more than 19 points here with us.
Yeah, okay. Well, I mean, what you've done, that group, is a very good summary of project design. I mean, you know, you get top marks in a course on how to design a project. But how to design a project for a pastoral system means answering each of the questions and each of the 19 points that you had in a particular way. So, what's the objective? Supporting, not replacing pastoralism. What's the sustainability of a project? Continuing within the pastoral system and being supported by the pastoral system? Who are the stakeholders to be involved? How does the pastoral community itself and its elders get involved? What's the timing? The timeline of a project not driven by the outsiders, but the timing that is compatible with people's own life cycles, and on and on. So, very helpful list, but the next step is to ask how this is rooted in pastoral settings, and we'll come back to that, I know. Because so many projects have been designed according to these criteria, but they missed the mark. In fact, they made things worse. So we have to think about these criteria in relation to pastoral systems, not in the abstract. Right, final one, and this is on financing.
County government budget allocation, that will also be through own source revenue, for example. For the national, will also be through subsidies. The mechanisms for it will be through the annual budget, so those that are enshrined in the annual development plans or county integrated development plans, the ward level allocations, etc. But then as a group, we were also proposing that we could have a particular fund that is dedicated for pastoralism within the county governments, just like we have the county climate funding mechanisms. Then we could also have one that is dedicated for pastoralism. Then we also have the climate finance mechanisms, and these are quite diverse. So, for example, through the county climate fund mechanism, which was also scaled up by FLOCA, the Financing Local-Led Climate Action, to cover the rest of the counties. We have the Green Climate Fund, we have Adaptation Fund, we have green bonds, grants, loans, or donor funds, etc. Then we also have community-driven funds, and the mechanism will be, for example, through the World Bank community-driven fund, or even through the NGO-led grant schemes. Then we also have conditional and unconditional transfer. By unconditional, we meet those that meet basic needs such as food, water, and health. The conditional, those that serve for example, school attendance, and so on. So the mechanism for dispensation of this will be through direct payment to households via mobile banks. We also have livestock insurance schemes. We have the public-private partnerships. So nowadays we are shifting from WOGA, the whole of government approach, to WOSA, whole of society approach. So whereby we have governments partnering with private entities and so on. Then we also have the carbon finance and national resource financing. So these are mechanisms such as the carbon credits, but probably the issue of under discussion will be how we have negotiated in terms of the carbon markets. Then we also have results-based financing. So this is under programs such as the P4R, the one by World Bank. Then we also have private investors or philanthropists or individuals who also support the pastoralism initiatives. Then we have emergency and humanitarian fund. So for example, funds that will finance early warning, or we could even have contingency funds by National Disaster Management Authority and so on. Then we also discussed as a group that financing is not only in monetary terms, it could also be in kind. So we could also have CSR initiatives done by private persons. So for example, we have an example of Mustabis, an individual who was able to help in coming up with boreholes. We could even have precasts. Why should we insist on building structures from the scratch? Why don't we also think about the precasts for infrastructure such as schools, hospitals, and so on? Thank you.
Wow, big list. Thank you so much, Eunice. That was a fantastic list. But again, rather like the question of the implementation, how do we make all these funds? There's no shortage of funds. I mean, the decline of US aid and so on had big shocks around the system, but there are still plenty of other funds. But they come with conditions. They come with expectations. They come with processes by which you have to get those funds. How do we make these funds that may be under climate, that may be under crisis, they may be under community, they may be under sectoral support? How do we make these funds pastoralism compatible? Because our experience of the last years is that a lot of these funds actually do not end up delivering the type of change that we want. Think about the amount of money that's gone into dryland areas over the last decades. Billions of dollars, not even shillings. Billions. Has it made a difference? Some, but not all of it. How do we gear these funds? And this is part of the debate that we must have, and this list is incredibly useful. How do we gear these funds to achieve the objectives of supporting pastoralism in a sustainable way, in ways that are not undermined by a great big green climate fund coming with just one view of the world, or a huge great crisis management fund undermining how pastoralists are already coping? That's our challenge for this week, is to start to rethink these very fundamental things across the architecture of aid and humanitarian business. And I think this was a very nice start. I'll keep these, we'll put these 6 up on the wall somewhere. We can come back to them, add to them, think about them. But this was a very good initiation.